Well, it's fantastic to be with so many of you this morning, and obviously there's a really nice mix of expertise in the room. So I'm certainly expecting that we'll have a really good conversation as we go through the morning, and I'm looking forward to hearing many of the speakers that are lined up. Although the title of the presentation is around Policy 3 on NPF, I do just want to take a couple of minutes to put that in context of some of the wider modernisation changes that are underway. And we've actually got 3 live consultations at the moment, all of which actually are very relevant to what we're speaking about this morning. So obviously we have our 4th draft national planning framework. We are also consulting on draft regulations for development planning. And there is draft local development planning guidance, and that includes guidance that's relevant to some of the discussions today. We are also introducing new statutory requirements on the preparation of open space strategies. And there is a live consultation out just now as well. Worth mentioning too that forestry and woodland strategies are also now on a statutory footing. So what is the National Planning Framework? Well, it is a long-term plan setting out our approach to planning and development to help achieve a net zero sustainable Scotland by 2045. I'm sure you've all perused the entire document cover to cover, and you'll know that it comprises 5 parts. So there is, of course, the spatial strategy. There are also 18 proposed national developments to support the spatial strategy. And we have a suite of revised draft national planning policies. There is also a section setting out our intentions around delivery, and we will be preparing a live delivery programme to accompany the finalised and adopted NPF. Obviously, there's also a set of annexes at the end, including a glossary. So what's different with the 4th National Planning Framework? Well, first of all, the status of the 4th NPF and the bringing together of the spatial and thematic planning policies together in one place for the first time. NPF4 will be part of the development plan once adopted. Now, planning decisions have to be determined as a matter of law in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So this status means that NPF4 will have a much stronger, more direct role in day-to-day decision making, including on individual planning applications. This approach to setting out national planning policy as part of the development plan through NPF also means that it's part of wider changes to the LDPs themselves, our local development plans. There will be no need for local development plans to repeat national policies, freeing up resource for planning authorities to focus on delivery. The local development plan system will also move to a 10-year cycle. It's currently 5 years, and again, the intention is that that will help to free up resources. Now, individual planning authorities can still bring forward local policies if there's evidence and reason to depart from the national framework. So thinking a bit more about the policies in the draft NPF then, the Planning Policy Handbook should be taken and read as a whole, and there are 35 draft policies overall. 6 of these are universal policies which are to be applied to all planning decisions, and that includes Universal Policy 3 on addressing the nature crisis that we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. This is quite a busy slide, I appreciate. It's really just trying to pull out some of the key policy changes. Now, the overall cross-cutting drivers of climate and the nature crisis are embedded and reflected right throughout the NPF. So there are a whole suite of relevant policies, for example, around woodland and trees, on our approach to blue-green infrastructure and natural places, amongst others. The policy intention overall is to limit new development which impacts on the climate or on nature. So just thinking then a little bit more specifically about our approach through NPF to positive effects for biodiversity. So this Scottish approach takes into account the different contexts of urban and rural environments, the variety of different circumstances right across Scotland. The focus is very much on enhancing connectivity, and our approach has been very much to embed our Scottish nature networks throughout the NPF. We're also wanting to promote nature-based solutions to climate change, which also protect and restore biodiversity. Now, climate change and nature recovery, as I've mentioned, are primary guiding principles for all plans and decisions, and that's reflected in their coverage within the universal policies. Our focus through NPF4 is very much on on-site enhancement. There are no complex metric requirements here or cash tariffs. There will, however, be a continuing role for the use of developer contributions where the relevant statutory tests are met. So obviously we're different in many respects to net gain, as you'll understand, being brought forward through legislation in England. So a very Scottish approach to reflect Scottish circumstances, and very much a policy approach through the NPF. So there's been quite a long journey. Obviously, the draft NPF itself has been longer than expected in preparation due to COVID, and we had the extra step of consulting on our position statement as following on from the early call for ideas back in 2020, and that seems like a very long time ago. So our approach is to build on, to expand, and really to strengthen significantly current policies in the NPF3 and Scottish Planning Policy 2014. The approach is very much informed by NatureScot's very helpful 2020 research looking at policy options for securing positive effects for biodiversity. And has been informed by the biodiversity working group, which several of you have contributed to, including CIEEM. So thank you to all involved in that. The draft universal policy provisions on appropriate measures applying to local developments, and we'll come on to that in a second. That's supported by the draft NatureScot guidance, and we're really delighted that we've been able to work collaboratively with NatureScot so that the draft guidance is also out to consultation at the same time, and Simon Brooks will be speaking about that more next. So draft policy 3 then. Well, first of all, the expectation is set out for local development plans to facilitate biodiversity enhancement across the plan area. Now, there are real opportunities there to link up with wider actions, with wider delivery partners across the land use arena as a whole, and we can come on to that again in a moment. So real opportunities for the local development plan to set out the overall spatial strategy. Then thinking about the determination of individual planning applications, the overall approach is targeted and scaled. The aim is to mainstream the consideration of biodiversity across the spectrum of planning applications. That's what we want to see. We want it to be the norm for developers to design in biodiversity enhancement from the outset. So we want to make that as simple and as easy to do as possible. And so there is now an expectation that applications for local development will design in appropriate measures to enhance biodiversity. And this is where the NatureScot guidance is applicable. We've targeted the most stringent policy requirements for the larger scale applications or those applications that are likely to have significant environmental effects. And our policy in NPF is very clear that these will only be supported if the development proposal will conserve and enhance biodiversity. And this means leaving biodiversity in a demonstrably better state than before. Now, there are certain exceptions throughout the draft policy 3, and we'd really welcome your views on whether those are the right exceptions to make, whether they're appropriate, as well, of course, on the detailed draft wording itself. So, looking ahead then to having a new system in place and to having a finalised and adopted NPF hopefully in due course. All of you on the call, no doubt, will very much be at the heart of delivery and implementation. And we think there are real opportunities here for shaping new style local development plans, which facilitate biodiversity enhancement, nature recovery and nature restoration across the development plan area. And that, as we've set out, is a policy expectation. We also think there are real opportunities here for the join up. So thinking back to the open space strategies, for example, we think LDPs should be informed by other relevant strategies and action plans, for example, the local biodiversity action plan, as well as the forestry and woodland strategy, the open space strategy, etc. And we want LDPs to set out the proposals and actions to protect, restore and enhance biodiversity within the local authority area. And that's just a nod to the draft local development plan guidance that's out to consultation, and it's worth having a look at some of the context that sets out around the role of local development plans. We also think that the local development plan should set out the circumstances in which developer contributions for enhancing biodiversity may be required, setting out upfront the expectations so that all concerned, including developers, are clear from the outset. And then finally, when Simon will come on to talk about the guidance, the NatureScot guidance on the appropriate measures that can be built into local development, there's also, of course, opportunity for individual local authorities to prioritise particular measures according to the priority actions, for example, in their own local biodiversity action plan, etc., or to take account of local circumstances.
That's 2 minutes there, Cara.
Thank you. So I mentioned earlier that there'll be new statutory requirements on preparing open space strategies. And the expectation is that these will identify the key green networks across the area, and will also identify how those green networks can be enhanced. And that's an opportunity there for opportunities mapping in spatial form to really help direct where activities and focus where potential offsetting might be directed to. So this is the kind of the spatial element of it all. There's certainly opportunities there linked to the LDP. So just coming to a close there then, a reminder that we've got 3 consultations out, not only the NPF, but also the LDP consultation and the open space strategies. All consultations are open until the 31st of March. What I would say is that everybody has views on planning. You'll be aware of this yourselves. Please tell us what you want changed. Please tell us what we can improve, but please also tell us what we've got right in the draft NPF, because chances are, if you think something is good and you want to keep it, there might be others that have a different view and are arguing for it to be changed. So give us your full views, and we're really looking forward to hearing them. There are some consultation resources online on our webpage to help inform responses, and the web link is up there just now. And that's everything from me just now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Cara. That's brilliant, very informative. Really good to get the general overview as well, to set the universal policy in context.
All right, well, good morning, and thanks for CIEEM for inviting me to speak at the event. My task is to take you through NatureScot's Developing with Nature guidance that is currently out to consultation, and provide a bit of background to our thinking when producing this. And just to note that for brevity, when I refer to the guidance, I mean the draft consultation guidance that is out there at the moment. So just to start with the, if you like, the policy background, I'm not going to repeat what Cara has said, but this is what has prompted the production of this guidance. So as you'll know, government is focused very much on addressing the twin climate and nature crises, and its efforts are in part underpinned by the new statutory requirement in the Planning Acts for Scottish ministers to consider how development can contribute to 6 NPF outcomes, one of which is this statutory term securing positive effects for biodiversity. In support of this, NPF Policy 3E sets out a requirement for local development to include appropriate measures to enhance biodiversity, proportionate to its nature and scale. Preparing guidance on what these appropriate measures are and how to select these measures was the task that government set NatureScot. And this followed on from a review of existing local authority guidance that's out there, that we presented to the Scottish Government's working group, that showed that firstly, local authorities were identifying a common set of measures, but also there was a lot of duplication of effort in terms of the guidance that was being produced by individual planning authorities. The intention is that the guidance we've produced is of use to both applicants seeking permission, but also the planning officers determining the application. And the commission that Scottish Government gave us asked that its content was easily accessible to both the professional and lay reader. Just to reiterate a point, that this guidance does apply to this particular policy focused on local development. And so this encompasses anything from a house extension, a single house, up to 49 dwellings or a business unit, up to 10,000 square metre floor space on sites smaller than 2 hectares. So some of the developments are quite large, but it does go down to much smaller ones, but obviously with the exclusion of householder development. So what are these appropriate measures? Scottish Government asked us to identify the measures that are deliverable without unreasonable cost, but yet were ambitious and delivered more than mitigation. Large-scale and off-site biodiversity measures were not considered appropriate for this guidance and the type of proposals that would be covered by the policy. And this is a list of what we identified. 23 common and largely straightforward measures for enhancing biodiversity, which are set out in some detail in section 2 of the guidance. And we group these measures under 3 headings: planting for nature, providing homes for nature, and managing water with nature. But these are not rigid groups, and importantly, individual measures need to be considered in the round, taking into account their wider needs and synergies. For example, nest sites need available foraging habitats, and water features can be complemented well by the provision of drain escapes. I'd highlight here 3 things that the guidance does not provide. Firstly, it's not an exhaustive list of all possible measures that could be undertaken in support of biodiversity, but it focuses on those that are easily and widely applicable. Secondly, it doesn't include more specialist measures for particular protected species, as these will require ecological expertise beyond what the guidance is intended to provide. This guidance is aimed at supporting applications that will not have access to such expertise in general terms. And third, it doesn't seek to duplicate more detailed design and management guidance that will be required to implement each of these measures. Such information is well presented in a host of other sources that this guidance directs people to, and we didn't want to just duplicate that. So each of the measures that we are described in the guidance follows a similar format. Firstly, there's a short description of what the measure comprises, then an overview of what benefit it provides for nature. We want people to understand why they're doing this. What are the species or habitats that it's going to help? What are the key requirements if you're going to implement this measure and it's going to be successful? You need to know that. And then a description of what future management effort is required. There's no point putting a measure in if then it's just forgotten about and won't work in the future. Then importantly, are there other measures that it complements, that it can support? We also included a section called Nature Notes, which provides supporting biodiversity information, again raising awareness and understanding about why we're doing this and what it's going to achieve. And finally, and quite important, are the web links to sources of further information on implementing, delivering the particular measure. Now, we're well aware that the consultation draft is a lot of words, and it's certainly not going to excite people, but that's the nature of trying to get something out for consultation at this stage. So it doesn't include illustrations, but we did provide a mock-up to accompany the consultation. So although the finalised guidance will also be web-based, our intention is to present it in a much more engaging format. And this is sort of a possible example that we're looking at, having the finalised guidance presented as. We included these mock-ups of a potential layout, not only to show how the guidance can be more engaging, but also to convey the level of detail we want to get across to the reader. As I said, this isn't for expert audience, it's also for the lay reader. And it's to get away from this just being a very dry piece of guidance and one that will enthuse. So having identified the types of measures that can be implemented, which are the ones and how do you select the ones that are going to be appropriate? And that's set out in section 3 of the guidance. So we've tackled this in 3 ways. And the first consideration is thinking about the suitability of the proposed development, considering scale and form of the development. A simple example to illustrate this point would be an orchard would be a poor fit with a very small site, or one that just involves built development with no garden or landscape grounds. And there's quite a complex, large table in the guidance that tries to summarise this and convey this information, so that any reader can get an overview of how the measures fit with, their scale and form of development. The next 2 sets of consideration we identified relate to ensuring the measures applied to ensure the measures applied can be successful and provide the greatest benefit for nature. The first of these are ecological considerations, and these include thinking about native species, providing for connectivity, both within the site and out with it, allowing space for nature to adapt, and taking taking account of synergies with the other measures. And then secondly, the practical considerations include how nature and people will interact once the development is occupied, taking account of things such as potential disturbance in the future. How the longer term management will be guaranteed in the future. Thinking about, are there opportunities for local community involvement with the measures? And that could be through the actual installation of the measures, its future management, or perhaps undertaking surveys in the future. And then finally, delivering wider benefits at the same time. So not just for biodiversity, but thinking about things such as water and temperature regulation and other nature-based solutions. Informing these considerations will be supporting strategies and existing knowledge. So existing strategies include LBAPs, the Green Network and open space strategies being produced, and forest and woodland strategies. And information held by local wildlife groups and local biological record centres will also be a useful source of information to inform decisions on what's going to be appropriate. And then the difficult question of, well, how much enhancement is required? Policy 3E talks about in proportion to the nature and scale of development. The draft guidance suggests 4 considerations. The nature, scale and location of development, so making the most of the site and the proposal. Does it lend itself to larger actions or multiple smaller ones? Also considering the nature and cost and management of the measures themselves. While small development can incorporate many of the simpler measures, larger development should be expected to deliver at scale. The third consideration we identified is the time and uncertainty in delivering benefits. And this is about finding the balance between achieving quick wins for biodiversity, what can be done relatively easily, but also the longer and perhaps bigger gains that come in the future, but also bring with them more uncertainty, greater uncertainty, because you don't know whether it's going to be achieved. And then finally, thinking about the opportunity, the scale of opportunity for enhancement. The greater the opportunity, the higher the expectation that the development should realise this. So the guidance is out for consultation at the moment. And these are the 3 questions that we have set to prompt views on this. Question 1 is focused on the range of the appropriate measures, the 23 appropriate measures we've identified, and whether there are others that we've not identified that should be included. Question 2 is exploring the level of information provided in the guidance. Is there too little or too much, particularly on the individual measures, but also do we need to provide greater or lesser detail on the questions about how you select these and how much should be required? And question 3 is seeking views on the usefulness of the guidance when applied by the applicant to project design, but also for planners when considering what applications have brought forward in their proposals for biodiversity.
That's 2 minutes, Simon.
Thanks. So next steps, the consultation is open until the 4th of March. It was originally the 4th of February, but we've extended it by a month to give more time, recognising that I think a lot of people are going to be very busy with the whole range of planning consultations that are out there at the moment. And we welcome all comments to help improve the draft and ensure it aids delivery of the NPF policy as best it can. Following the consultation, there'll be obviously revision of the guidance, to take into account not just the comments received, but any government modifications to the NPF4 policy that it supports. We realise that's also out for consultation and may well be revised in some way. So timescales are uncertain, but we would hope that we can publish revised guidance as close to possible to when the finalised NPF4 is finally adopted. So I look forward to not only the discussion today, but also receiving, comments to our formal consultation through the website. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so just a brief introduction on our approach to embedding biodiversity and net gains in a transmission project. We first started looking at biodiversity net gain and the metrics back in 2017, and I'm sure most people are aware of the 10 principles of biodiversity net gain, but the ones that really kind of showed themselves to us as why this was the way forward was Principle 5, which is about making a measurable net gain, Principle 8, which is about creating a legacy from your net gains, and also Principle 10, which is actually being transparent, so actually showing how you've demonstrated that you are achieving a net gain. On the back of the projects that we trialled, there were 5 substation sites. We have committed to no net loss in biodiversity and non-irreplaceable habitats for all our projects gaining consent from April 2020. That's measured by our metric, and a net gain on all projects gaining consent from 2025. The way that we've embedded biodiversity is shown in this slide here, and basically this shows that you have to include biodiversity at every single stage in your development process. As we work through the development stages, you get more level of detail of what your project is, so the data that's actually available becomes more defined as well. So right at the start, at the optioneering stage, we have developed a site optioneering toolkit. That's something that we spent a lot of time working together with our consultant to actually do that, and that gives you a very early idea of how much biodiversity is present on that site, measured by our metric. And then once we get more definition of what the project is going to be, then we go to the full biodiversity net gain assessment. So what does it actually look like? Well, this is a metric. There's an Excel spreadsheet that's based primarily on the Natural England Biodiversity Metric 2.0, because that's what was current when we were developing this. So it looks purely at habitats and gives each habitat a distinctiveness score, a condition score, and out of that you get a biodiversity unit, which is a proxy of the biodiversity value for that particular parcel of land. In practice, when we look at that at the very first stage, so here we're looking at a route study. We've got three routes across there, and what we've done is we've run our site optioneering toolkit over those routes, and based on existing data, we have calculated the distinctiveness of those habitats and color coded them. So purple is the most distinctive habitat, and blue is the least, and this gives us a very early sight of where the most important areas for biodiversity are, and that can help inform future development of that. When we have more definition and we're looking at kind of sites themselves, and we know exactly what we're going to build, we use the biodiversity net gain assessment, the full biodiversity net gain tool, to design the landscape plan. So it's really looking at what the losses, the permanent losses are here as a substation, and what we have to do around that substation to compensate for the losses. And we balance it all up using the metric, because it gives you these biodiversity units that you can compare what you've lost against what you need to provide. So the kind of things that we actually do to enhance biodiversity is we replant previously failed habitats, we replace habitats like amenity grassland with better habitats like semi-improved grassland, we can remove non-native species, which improves the condition of a habitat. You can improve the condition of marshy grasslands and other wetlands by blocking up ditches. You can restructure existing woodlands as well to enhance biodiversity, and it also gives you the opportunity to explore the other opportunities you can plant within your wayleave. So why do we use a metric? Well, it's a regulatory requirement now. Ofgem asks us to kind of report on an annual basis about on the biodiversity that we've impacted on and the biodiversity that we've designed into our new projects. We believe it is a better way to measure those impacts and to inform the mitigation that is required. It can demonstrate the benefits of the habitat creation and enhancement to stakeholders. That can be internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And also we see it as a potential way to help develop off-site compensation as well. We've developed this toolkit together with our consultant, and as I said, we've been working on this since 2017. But we do believe that there are issues with actually using, say, the Natural England metric in Scotland without actually some kind of changes needed to be made to that. We've got a much greater prevalence of peatland and ancient woodland in Scotland, so we have to have a think about what condition peatland is irreplaceable, what isn't, what impacts on peatland could be acceptable, which ones aren't. The water body classification is based on an Environment Agency approach, which is not well known in Scotland. We do think that there needs to be an acknowledgement of the benefits of peatland restoration and other nature-based solutions, which doesn't quite work so well within the Natural England toolkits. The approach that Natural England take towards assessment, like the red line boundary, isn't practical for larger developments where you have a lot of area that you're not actually impacting on. We think that condition assessments, the risk factors and the habitat distinctiveness scores need to be adapted for use in Scotland, and what we've done with our toolkit is we provide a lot more flexibility to the consultants to be able to adjust those scores to take into account the wide variety that we have in Scotland. And we think there needs to be a greater level of flexibility to aid the required strategic delivery of biodiversity. It's not only just biodiversity that we're looking at. We know that the biodiversity crisis and climate change are intrinsically linked. So, and also that when we use this biodiversity metric, we can help communities deliver the kind of enhancements that they need. We also see that kind of biodiversity is part of natural capital valuations, and we will be reporting on our natural capital by 2025 at the very latest. When you're looking at biodiversity gains, there's also other additional social benefits that kind of come along with that, like opportunities for employment and upskilling and volunteering opportunities. But we also believe that strategic biodiversity goals can lead to more and better biodiversity outcomes in the longer term. Just quickly on this, I'm aware of time, is that alongside all of this other biodiversity metric work we've been doing, we also have very robust toolkits now to report on the biodiversity that we have impacted on and the biodiversity that we are delivering on our projects. And to date, we have assessed over 25 projects using our toolkit. So that is a very, very brief run through of how we approach biodiversity net gain. Questions?
Thank you, Francis. There's a comment as much as a question from Catherine Scott at Glasgow City Council, who wants to query the Scottish context. This is more probably a question for Cara and others, the Scottish Government, so maybe can be addressed later in the breakout session. So the Scottish context, which seem to imply less money for biodiversity here compared to South East England, hence can't do biodiversity net gain. I think from the breakout session earlier, having the range of local authorities from the sort of Shetland and other island councils and some of the bigger local authorities certainly does raise that question. So Cara, I may ask you to come back on that one later. And then another comment just from Marina regarding peatlands, the Scottish Peatland Action Plan, key document for any developer. So it's interesting that the internationally accepted metric you've adopted for use in Scotland at SSEN, but also now considering the incorporation of sort of natural capital approaches as well, Francis. Have you any key lessons learned? Are you confident that the adaptations are working well and could be rolled out elsewhere in Scotland with local authorities and other industries?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, adopting a biodiversity net gain approach has driven massive changes within SSEN transmission. One quick example is Thurso South, where we have created habitat, and now we've got great yellow bumblebees nesting kind of on site. I can't, it's not enough time really to kind of talk through all of the benefits that actually measuring biodiversity can actually give an organisation, and that's recognised by Ofgem, and that we have to demonstrate the benefits of the biodiversity enhancements that we undertake, which is why a unit is so important to have. I mean, we don't put a financial value on a biodiversity unit, because I don't think that is necessarily the right way to go. We are looking at using our biodiversity units to look at off-site compensation. So in that, we are looking towards the third sector to provide, where we can't mitigate the impacts on site, we then go out to a third party and say that we need X number of biodiversity units. What can you deliver? How much is that going to cost? Because you can't put just an overall, an arbitrary figure on that biodiversity, because it depends on the delivery partner. It depends on the type of habitat you are creating. But that's something that we're just developing. So far, we have delivered all of our biodiversity gains on land that we own.
Okay, and a question from Becky Plunkett. Regulatory reporting on natural capital by 2025. Which regulations are you referring to here?
We are regulated by Ofgem, so they are the that's who kind of regulate us, and that's why we are going to carry on measuring in biodiversity units as well, because that is the reporting requirement that we actually have.
And I'll kick us off because Annie's given us a really nice introduction. So forgive me, I didn't know how exactly people would be coming to this workshop today, and how much people would necessarily know about biodiversity net gain, given when we're considering positive effects for biodiversity, that, as I understand, incorporates different ways at the moment. So I put together this nice little slide, and I kind of do want to run it because I've done lots of nice animation on it to briefly show what we do mean by biodiversity net gain. At its simplest, it's seeing what was there before, perhaps this lovely orchid. Development comes along and perhaps the orchid gets ploughed up, or maybe it stays. But afterwards, whatever we have afterwards, we want to make sure that we have more and it's better than it was before. So I have a lovely picture of 3 orchids here. That is simplifying it quite a lot. So in terms of measurability, that's what biodiversity net gain does as an outcome, but it's also a process which Francis touched on. It's got a suite of principles that follow this, and you can find those easily online from CIEEM website. So why did we wish to use the metric to answer the same question as Francis set out? Well, we felt that, again, it would be a way to inform the design of ecological and landscape mitigation in a way where we have a different kind of lens on how that was done, which would actually require us to have quite a close working relationship with our landscape colleagues. as well as to try and identify what the scheme was likely to do. Would it actually achieve a net gain? Would it achieve a net loss? Or would there be perhaps no change in the overall biodiversity once the scheme was done? We thought it might be a better and more robust way to demonstrate policy compliance, as well as supporting decision making. And we thought it could be a way for accounting for losses for biodiversity where we felt that it wasn't fully covered by existing legal and planning systems. At the moment in ecology, or as an ecological consultant, which I am, in not using biodiversity net gain, what sometimes happens is the focus becomes on particular kinds of habitats, particular high value habitats, which might be picked out in local biodiversity action plans or the Scottish biodiversity list. But it can mean that other habitats are neglected, and we didn't want to do that. Finally, we understood that this particular project is a flagship project. It's going to be a project that is has a kind of impact on the landscape. It's going to be one of those places where it feels like it's got its own identity. And so there was a desire to be innovative here and really strive for excellence. So we thought that by doing a biodiversity net gain approach, we demonstrate that extra level of robustness and quality. So we thought this would evidence the planning compliance and legal policy well. Planning policy and legal requirements well. We thought that as well as doing all this, ultimately it would have the effect that we hope on biodiversity to improve diversity, connectivity and resilience. And finally, we thought there would be maybe benefits to the industry in terms of showing how innovation can work in a particular project that we could share, and mayhaps support Falkirk Council, where this project is located, to lead the way in kind of doing things differently in terms of biodiversity. So I'll show the next slide, which briefly shows the scheme. So here we can see it. So we used UK HAB. I don't know if you're familiar with that. UK HAB is a particular habitat classification system that is relatively new, but is getting used more often. In particular, we use this method just because it aligns much better with using the biodiversity metric that we did use. But I just wanted to also talk about the objectives for this particular project. So at the beginning, we set out and we met the council, and we agreed that for this project, we wanted to try and achieve a 5% net gain. So we wanted to have 5% more biodiversity after the development than beforehand. We wanted to make sure that it contributed to local planning policy for biodiversity, green infrastructure and sustainable design. We wanted to make sure that it contributes to the local biodiversity action plan and that it ties in with that, which is a requirement also of the biodiversity net gain principles, if you read those. We wanted to make sure that it integrated the landscape plan so that it might provide multiple benefits, which relates to another aspect of one of the principles. We wanted to make sure that it would provide additional benefits in terms of the way the sustainable urban drainage systems were done, again, which relates to certain spirit of the principles. And we wanted to use natural mitigation as a way to do things as well, which relates again to the way that the principles are set out. So overall, we had these there's 5 here, but related to all different aspects of integrating planning policy, biodiversity priorities, other benefits. So to begin with, we undertook a baseline. We used the Natural England Deferometric 2. You may be aware that since then, a new metric has come out, and that will be discussed shortly. But initially we had this metric and we used this. We used existing information and we need to use some assumptions. So the next slide will come with a bit of, or the point below comes with a little bit of a health warning for that. But the baseline assessment was helpful in that it gave us an initial idea of habitats that were important or could be tricky in terms of mitigation or may require compensation, a little bit like Francis's earlier presentation where you could see that really nice map. We had a similar situation where we could pick out those important habitats. It also served as an initial basis for conversation as well with our clients, the council. And then we did an interim assessment. So at this point, we had to really interrogate the landscape plan. We had to see what was on there. It looked really good. Would it actually deliver? What we found was that we got an amazing net gain for hedges because there wasn't too many before. But for other kinds of habitats, which we call area habitats, which is just biodiversity net gain terminology, we found that we had a net loss. So it was about 9%. But that's not the end of the story. The idea is that the process is iterative, and it gave us a point of which we could go back and address and see what could be done next to try and meet our objectives. So at this point, I will pass on to Sarah, and you may be able to take us on the next part of the journey.
Can you move the slide on, Hannah? I don't have control. Thank you. So this is kind of to move on to where the project is currently at, and we're still working on the scheme, so it's not finalised, but to really talk through the steps of where we are. So initially the work was done in metric 2.0, and as some of you might be aware, last year metric 3.0 came out. So we thought that gave us an interesting opportunity to see how that data compared if we ran it in the new metric, what the changes were, and did that affect our numbers, and then kind of moving on to look at the outcomes and where we take it next. So we took that initial baseline data that we had and used exactly the same data, put it into metric 3.0, which did have some interesting changes in it in terms of the numbers. So from tweaks between metric 3.0 and 2.0 and changes that DEFRA have made to the metric, it really altered our overall assessment. And rather than coming out as a loss as we had before, it was now showing that we were just about a 2% gain. So interesting to see how the metrics evolved over time with kind of review in England. The main reasons for those changes were largely around how the scores that were being given in the metric to the time taken to achieve woodland to the target condition that we were targeting within the metric. So that was the main thing that led to the change, really. The other thing that the version 3.0 of the metric pulled out was really one of the key principles of biodiversity net gain is making sure that you're either providing habitats on a like for like or better basis. Metric 3.0 gives you a better representation of how well you have met with those trading rules, so that your overall target figure you could achieve, but you might not have met with the trading rules. For example, you could be losing a really high value habitat and putting in lots of habitat that's of a lower value, but because of the extent of area you're providing, your units could equal the same. Now that wouldn't meet with the trading rules, but it might show that you're coming out as a no net loss, for example. So the important thing is making sure that we're providing habitats that are at least of the same value of those coming out. So looking the detail that they're running it in 3.0 showed us is that we need to look again at those trading rules and go back to the landscape plan to see where we can perhaps put in some other bits of woodland, and probably where we're at next is we're kind of just in the process of exploring those results and looking over the landscape plans, and we will be targeting some off-site enhancement and creation to make sure that we're getting that gain, but we're achieving it within the trading rules. At the moment we've got a slight gain, but we're not quite meeting the principles. So it's important that the kind of number value, you don't just focus on that, but you need to take the principles along with you, because that means that you're actually achieving that net gain, and it's not just down to the numbers, it's about the kind of ecological processes behind it, and kind of making sure that the values you're achieving on site actually do what you want to in terms of biodiversity enhancements. So the next step is we're looking at some areas that the council have suggested for biodiversity enhancements, visiting those on site and working out what would be appropriate for those and what can be provided, and then we'll put that numbers back into the metric to see what our overall scores are at, but that's where the project is at the moment. So
thank you very much, Sarah and Hannah. Got a question from Carol McLean. Why you aimed for only 5% biodiversity net gain seemed quite low.
Oh, right. I suppose we've taken a method used in England primarily, and we've wanted to see how this does work in Scotland. And as part of that, I suppose perhaps being a bit tentative as to what could be achieved, but trying to pitch it just about right for this kind of development. At the time when we did decide to use this, it's worth saying that in England, you may know that there's a mandatory 10% biodiversity net gain that's required. At the time, there wasn't the same mandatory requirement that there will be. And it was generally more accepted that you may not necessarily go as far as 10%. Even now, it's something that does need to still be determined in England, because until it's mandatory, which isn't for another 2 years, these things will be negotiated. So we thought that that was a reasonable balance to aim for, given it's quite a big scheme, and as far as I know, the council hadn't really embarked on this process before. I hope that answers the question.